are happy that we are privileged to organize the birth bicentenary celebration of the greatest thinker of the last millennium, Karl Marx. We are also happy indeed that we are organizing a seminar with the speaker, Eric Tusser, eminent economist, political scientist and historian who is in Belgium, and his entire work mainly is thrust on the Latin America. He is the man who suggested Bank of South, that is an alternative to IMF World Bank model. He is also a man who headed the debt commission that was set up by Rafael Correa in Ecuador in 2007. And Eric is also a man who worked on the public debt of Greece. So we are happy indeed that he came to Colombo a few days back. We contacted on behalf of Sampriti Sanskriti and instantly agreed to come to our seminar, thanks to Eric Tusser. And we are really happy that yesterday only we contacted with Professor Dr. Ashim Dasgupta and we requested him to preside over today's function. And despite his busy schedule and other works, he preferred to come to our meeting, and this seminar will be presided over by him.
At the outset, I must thank the Sampriti Sanskriti for organizing this very topical seminar here. Professor Eric Tusser, very eminent economist, political scientist. It's true that even after making this approach, there have been back and forth movement in Latin American experience. We would like to hear it from him.
Happy to be with you today and to commemorate the birth of Karl Marx. We should remember that Karl Marx, speaking about the Paris Commune, which was, as he said, the first experience of the proletariat coming to power in the year 1871. He was celebrating the courage of the communards, the leaders of the Paris Commune. But he said they made a very big mistake. They didn't take the central bank of France. They let it totally free of acting against the commune. And he said if the communards had taken the control of the Banque de France, the Central Bank of France, they would have been capable to negotiate with the conservative power of the government who went to Versailles to take the counter-offensive against the communards. It would have been possible for the communards to negotiate a solution in favor of consolidating the revolutionary experience. But the communards were afraid of taking the control and the power on the central bank. And and on the banks. And it's a very important lesson from different experience in the two last centuries. Fortunately, the Bolsheviks in 1917 didn't hesitate to take the control and to expropriate all the banks, to nationalize the banks, to cancel all the, thanks to that, to cancel all the peasant debt and to finance the reconstruction of Russia and after that the USSR in the year after. Relating this decision of expropriation, nationalization of the private banks with the repudiation, total repudiation of all the Tsarist debt. It was that represent two major decisions who can explain the success of the Soviets at the beginning of the years 1920s. I would also underline the decision of Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. He was clearly a capitalist in favor of some Keynesian capitalism, but he took the strong decision to close down during 1 week all the banks in the US in March 1933 and to convince the Congress to adopt the famous Banking Act or Glass-Steagall Act, which separates totally investment bank from deposit bank, and which allow the US to avoid new banking crisis during 50 years until the years 80s and 90s, when the government of the USA decided to abrogate the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999, which is one of the main factors of the huge banking crisis of 2006, 7, 8 in the US and the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2018. We can also mention as an important decision related to the central banks and the bank, one of the first decisions of the revolutionary government after the victory of the Cuban Revolution, the 1st January of 1959. You will remember that Fidel Castro and his comrades decided to ask the Commandant Che Guevara to be the president of the Central Bank of Cuba. And it allowed the Cuban regime to finance the development of and the beginning of a transition to socialism in the year 60s. And it's exactly because the big capital using the year 1980s and 90s to organize an offensive against labor, it is because they took this offensive that they succeeded in deregulating totally the banking sector in the capitalist states, in the US, in Canada, in Europe, which provoked the crisis, banking crisis of 2006, 7, 8. And answering the crisis of the banks, the private banks, they decided, the big capital and the government, complice to the big capital, to bail out and to nationalize a lot of big banks. Royal Bank of Scotland in UK, Northern Rock, Bankia in Spain. Something like 20 big private banks has been nationalized after the crisis of 2008, but not in favor of the people. It was really the bailout of the capitalist system. They nationalized the banks because they were almost bankrupt, and it provoked a huge increase in the public debt in Europe and in North America. And now the objective is to re-privatize Royal Bank of Scotland when the cost for the British public was over 40 billion pounds to bail out Royal Bank of Scotland. Now they want to re-privatize it. In different countries of Europe, we are launching campaign to say these nationalized banks are our banks. We want a socialization of these banks. I refuse the re-privatization of these banks. Coming to the question of the banking sector in India, I brought here something like 15 articles published by the Financial Times. This the main financial daily paper in the world. We can rename it Financial Crimes. Financial Times, since 2 years, is leading a campaign against the public banking sector in India. Something like 20, 30 long articles like that, one-page articles to demonstrate that the public sector in India, banking public sector, is inefficient, is almost insolvent because of the huge amount of the NPAs. And it is the same taking into account the campaign led by the Prime Minister in India and the big capital in India against the public banking sector. And as you know, they underlined the huge amount of NPAs. I think that officially they say that the NPAs represent 12% of the total loans given by the banking public sector. But I have to tell you that this situation in India is not exceptional. Take into account the situation in Europe. The NPAs so the non-performing assets in Greece represent 45% of the total loans of the full banking sector of Greece, which is totally private. In Cyprus, NPAs represent 45%. In Portugal, 17%. In Slovenia, another country part of the Eurozone, 13%. In Italy, 12%. The NPAs in Italy represent 300 billion euros, more or less $360 billion of NPAs in Italy. When in India it's around $140 billion, the NPAs, total amount of NPAs. That's to say that Italy, which has much less population as India, 80 million inhabitants of Italy, has NPAs representing more than the double of the NPAs in India. And all these non-performing assets or non-performing loans are due to the private sector, not the public banking sector in Europe. So they have no lesson to give to India at this level. I say that not to try to convince you that there is no problem. Of course, there is a huge problem with the public banking sector in India. And you know very well why. The main reason is that the public banking sector is not led in favor of the majority of the population of India. It is complice to the big capital in India. The main public banks like Punjab National Bank gave a huge amount of loans to big capitalists like Moody, the jewelry, and other big corporations. I saw this morning the full list of willful defaulter. And it's clear that this chronic capitalism, which consists in giving loans from the public sector, mainly to the big capitalists, who are defaulting on that loan, provoke the crisis of the banking public sector in India. But the conclusion should not be to privatize the public banking sector. The conclusion should be to socialize really the banking sector in India and taking emergency measures to confront or to solve the crisis. I tried this morning to think about that and to make some proposal for the debate here. I would mention as a first priority to recover the losses provoked by the big capital in the public banking sector in India, to recovering the cost of that, the losses, on the general patrimony, the global fortune or global assets of this capitalist. Not only their share or the proportionally to not only a limited part of the asset, but recovering on the overall asset of the big capital to refinance on a good way the Indian public banking sector. To refuse, second measure, to refuse to bail out at the cost of the citizen and at the cost of the little depositors, the public banks, to refuse to recapitalize the bank at the cost of the citizen, but protecting the little depositors. We know that 90% of the deposits in the public banking sector are under 1 lakh rupees deposit. So the little depositors are still confident with the public banking sector of India, and they should be totally protected. No bail-in which could involve these little depositors. It is also needed to sue the responsible of the situation, the directors of the banks, of PNB or other banks, who gave loans to this capitalist or crony capitalist. But to sue also the same capitalist. And you know and I know that the Indian authorities let this capitalist to escape any risk of being sued in front of a tribunal. And Modi and others are now living quietly in Europe, escaping from their responsibility. I would say it would be also very important to take the decision to forbid any speculative activity for the banks, public and private banks. To say that the banking sector should support the productive sector in the society, to support the need of the household, to support the need of the local public authority who need money to develop projects related with the needs of the population. Also, as emergency policy, to force the private sector to look for financing their project with the private sector. So, not asking the public banks to finance the project of the big capital, but to finance the real economy. And the big capital should look for themselves and asking to the private sector to finance their project at their risk, with no guarantee from the government. Also, I think we should advocate for the full transparency of the accounts of the banks, public and private banks, to the suppression of the banking secrecy, to say to the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, that this central bank should control the activity of the public banks on site and no more asking private audit firms to do the job of the RBI and not accepting the official reports of the public banks without really auditing the real accounts to avoid what happened with the PNB and other banks who made a lot of transactions outside the country without giving the information, the related information to the RBI. Beyond that, we should advocate in favor of the full socialization of the banking sector. So to reorient the banking activity really in favor of the necessity of the masses. India and other countries need to struggle against climate change, to invest a lot of money for the ecological transition and to satisfy the need of the majority of the population. So that need a lot of money to do that. But to do that correctly, we need the full expropriation of the remaining private sector in the banks without compensation, and to redirect investment to legitimate projects under the control of the citizenship of the country. Now I would like to speak about the general international situation. We have to remember what has provoked the crisis in the Western countries and Western economies in 2008. It was the risk taken by the banks, private banks, creating structured products like mortgage-backed securities, asset-backed securities, which exploded in 2007 and 8 and provoked the banking crisis in North America and Europe, and provoke an international economic crisis all over the planet in 2009, with a lot of countries in recession in 2009. When this occurred in 2008, the government, Western government, say, we will moralize the banking sector. We will impose a new discipline. We will reduce the bonus and the salaries of the directors and CEOs of the private banks. But they didn't do that. The private banks didn't clean their balance sheet in the last 10 years. And the central banks, Western central banks, but also the Bank of Japan, decided to rescue these banks and to use the quantitative easing policy, buying to the same banks toxic products. Do you know that the US Federal Reserve bought something like 2 trillion toxic products to the US banks? So now, inside the balance sheet of the US Federal Reserve, you have a timing bomb of $2 trillion of toxic assets, MBS, ABS, etc. So they bought that to the banks, because if they didn't buy this asset, the financial private banking system would have collapsed. But in place of really cleaning the asset of the banks, they transferred the toxic assets to the balance sheet of the US Federal Reserve. And the same was done by the European Central Bank and by the Bank of England. Now, since 2 years, the European Central Bank is buying to the private banks and private corporation, non-financial corporation, for 60 billion euros monthly of toxic assets or of corporate bonds. What the banks are doing with this huge injection of liquidities and capital, they are not using this money to invest in the production. They are keeping on investing this huge amount of money in speculative activity. One of the main speculative activity is the buybacks of their own shares in the stock market. to maintain the capitalization of the banks or to increase the value of the securities of the same banks, but by buyback of this action. And also, they use the money given by the central banks to increase the dividend distributed to the shareholders. So now we have a new situation which prepares a new financial crisis in the Western countries, because we have a bubble on the corporate bond market. We have also a bubble at the level of the stock market, not only in Western countries, but also in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, in India, in several emerging economies. And the question is when these time bombs will explode. When will we have the explosion of the corporate bond bubble? When will occur the stock market, the explosion of the next crash of the stock markets? We don't know, but it will happen. Maybe if we succeed in promoting by mass mobilization other type of orientation and the implementation of other type of policies that very different from neoliberal policy, we would be able to avoid such crisis. But I have some doubt because it will come soon. What we should address is the challenge to explain to the masses the new crisis which is coming in front of us, and to convince more and more people of the necessity to adopt a comprehensive program in favor of implementing anti-capitalist policies, in favor of beginning a transition to a real socialist economy. I would say that's a challenge for us. We should defend some conquest, and one of these conquests is the nature of the existing public banking sector in India. The fact that, as the colleague, ex-minister of finance, tells us that 70% of the banking market here is controlled by the public banks. We should protect this conquest, but at the same time we should go beyond and radicalize the program and our proposal, because I am sure that there is a disponibility, there is availability, there is an openness in huge sector of the masses for radical left proposal. You should remember what happened 2 years ago in the preparation of the presidential election in the US. Imagine what would happen if the Democratic Party had chosen Bernie Sanders as its candidate. Bernie Sanders, who was advocating in favor of socialism in the USA, would have gained the election against Trump. All the polls were showing that. See what is happening in UK. When Jeremy Corbyn, as a leader, as a militant, anti-imperialist militant, succeeded in gaining the leadership of the Labour Party, he advocated for radical proposal, renationalization of the railways, renationalization of the postal service in UK, suppression of the fees in the university, strengthening the National Health Service in UK. All that radical proposal receive a very warm support in the masses in June 2017. And the Labour Party gained a lot of members of the parliament. And Theresa May lost a lot of members of the parliament. She is the prime minister, but in a permanent crisis of her government. So we see that not only in UK and in US, remember what happened in Greece in 2015. The people massively vote in favor of Syriza, hoping, expecting a radical policy. They also support Podemos in Spain, on the left bloc in Portugal. The problem is not really, for me, at the level of the masses. The problem is at the level of the leadership of the radical left formation. They are too timid. They are too moderate. They don't tackle really the new challenge presented by the capitalist crisis and the climate change crisis. So the challenge is to really adopt newly a policy advocated by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, proposing to expropriate the big capital and to go for the construction of socialism. Thank you very much for your attention.
We already have two questions in written form, which is a good number to start with. But may I request other inquisitive members of the audience to raise your voice. Whatever thing which is bothering you, you put down it in your paper and ask it. We don't have too much of time. First question is, how does a state protect its banking sectors when it itself becomes an agent of neoliberal forces? It's from Friends of Latin America, India. Can you take these two questions? Second is, what were the prime states Morales took before declaring Bolivia as free of IMF and World Bank loan, in spite of having water crisis still in existence?
Okay.
There is a third question, why the left cannot be able to deliver radical slogans throughout the world?
Yeah, the last question, I share the question. Why the left is not able to deliver radical slogans throughout the world? I think that there is still a traumatism after the experience, Stalinist experience in the 20th century, implosion of and collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. There is a real challenge from the part of the leadership of the radical left to have the courage to defend really radical socialist proposal and to recognize that there is not anymore the possibility of convincing the big capital to accept neo-Keynesian policies. You know, the big capital in the year 1930s accepted neo-Keynesian policies led by Roosevelt himself and Keynes in the UK. And after the Second World War, the workers' movement who struggled against the Nazis in Europe had the power to pressure on the big capital to make concession, to avoid socialist revolution. But now this big capital doesn't want anymore to make concession. They want to confront the masses. They want to destroy what still exists from the welfare state. They want to put in competition all the working classes and all the peasants of the world, and confronting, putting in competition Chinese peasants and workers against US or European or Indian workers and peasants. So they will not be coming from the capitalist system a capacity or a volunteer of auto-reform. So we should say that we need more than 1 century ago, we need a socialist or communist solution to the crisis. Not for ideological reason, but for in relation with the necessity. Because the climate change crisis and the economic crisis led the masses to the level of impoverishment at a very huge level. So the other question, how does the state protect its banking sector when it itself becomes an agent of neoliberal forces? Yeah, it's clear. A state will not protect its banking public sector if it becomes itself an agent of neoliberal policy. They will not. So it's the masses who can take the initiative. And if you know what happened in Venezuela, I was in 2008 an advisor of the Minister of Economy and Planification. Ayman El-Trudi was at this epoch the Minister of Economy. I tried to convince them to nationalize the banking sector in Venezuela, and they didn't do that. They only nationalized the Bank of Venezuela, paying a huge amount of compensation to the main Spanish bank, Santander, who was very happy with the compensation. So I was explaining to our comrade Asim, ex-minister of finances, that the problem in Venezuela is that the Chavez government, at the positive level, was distributing the majority of the incomes coming from the export of oil by Venezuela in favor of the masses. But at the end of the process of the circulation of the money, this money distributed by the state was accumulated in the private banking sector by the same capitalist classes, which is a comprador capitalist classes. They don't want to develop the country. They want to piller, to plunder the natural resources of Venezuela and to accumulate profit and capital, and they are doing so. That's the problem with the Maduro government now. I have a critical stance in front of the policy of the Maduro government. It's clear that in front of the aggressivity of Trump and the other, we defend the government of Venezuela. But we should also be critical with what they are doing, the limitation of the policy. And also, for instance, Chavez was saying, we will stop our participation to the IMF and the World Bank. But they didn't do that. They did something good. They decided, as Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, to withdraw from the exit, the World Bank Tribunal on Investment. It was a good decision, but insufficient. We had the possibility to create a Bank of the South. It was a decision of Chavez and 6 other presidents in Latin America, the president of Ecuador, of Bolivia, of Brazil, of Argentina, of Uruguay, of Paraguay. So 7 countries with, under the impulse of Chavez in Venezuela, decided to create the Bank of the South. And I was, in this epoch, advising the government of Rafael Correa in Ecuador on that question. And I participated to the writing of the Ecuadorian proposal related to the creation of the Bank of the South. And we really advocated in favor of an alternative multilateral bank, an alternative to the IMF and to the World Bank. In this epoch, 2007-8, it was possible to join a part of the foreign exchange reserve of the countries of the region and to build a powerful Bank of the South. The 7 presidents signed the agreement of the creation of the Bank of the South. They made a very big presidential meeting celebrating the birth of the new institution. But 10 years after, there is no a single loan given by the Bank of the South. It only exists on the paper. One of the reasons is the incapacity of the leftist government to go really forward to put in practice what they pretend to do. And also Brazil has an important responsibility. Brazil was supposed to support the Bank of the South, but in reality, Brazil participated to the Bank of the South to paralyze the process. Because they have their own Bank of Development, BNDES, and they want to control all the loans given to the neighbors, like Ecuador, Bolivia, etc. And they don't want a multilateral institution. So they participate to the Bank of the South to obstaculize really the development and the activity of the bank. And so the lesson is that beyond the discourse around the socialism on 21st century, we need radical left government who put really in practice what they pretend to do. And we need to have a auto-activity, self-organization of the masses to maintain a permanent pressure on the government. Because if there is no sufficient pressure from below, the pressure will come from the big capital on the leftist government to force them to make concession. So it's only with the pressure from below and a positive dialectic between the left government and the masses supporting him, that such government can go beyond the discourse and taking really the necessary policy needed by the population and the toiling masses. Thank you.